Hi, I'm Daisy Wolfenden. I'm MD at Wolfenden Agency, and this is Jason Sanderson, who's Head of Tracking and Data at Wolfenden Agency. And we wanted to have a session on GA4. Obviously, the migration date is coming up soon, so GA3 will sunset, and we're all going to move over to GA4. So we wanted to run through just a few of the most commonly asked questions that we have when we're doing training or migration points. And Jason is going to take us through and help show us, I guess, some of the core differences between GA3 and GA4. So I guess the biggest thing is overall, what would you say is the biggest change from GA3?
So I think from a marketer's point of view, the biggest change is going to be the interface itself.
Yeah.
We've gone from something we've been very familiar with for so long now, and it's completely changed the way the reports are shown, the way the data is structured in those reports. So that's the biggest difference, and it's what you can see on screen at the moment. It's very customizable, which is great compared to GA3. It's very limited to do anything bespoke in that platform. But if you came into it for the first time, it would be a huge shock. Yeah. And that's the thing that we see a lot of clients with having a resistance for.
It's like a scare factor. If you've used GA3 for so long, like you're just completely familiar with it, everything initially just takes a little bit longer with GA4. Like I think that for me anyway, that was the biggest thing. Still kind of is actually, but I'm getting more comfortable with it.
But as soon as you get into it, you realise that you've got access to the same data points and you've just got that additional flexibility in there.
Well, I guess actually do, because that's where the other biggest question is. Like at the beginning, I think a lot of the questions that we have from people and a lot of the concerns we have is they're going to lose all of their GA3 data. It's suddenly, July hits, all of their historical data is going to be somehow blown up and never be accessible again. True or false?
So Google are planning to get rid of the GA3 data sets, but they've not given us a defined date for it yet. Mm-hmm. They basically have said that after the cutoff point in July, they're going to give us at least a 6-month window with that GA3 data. So It won't record anything new from that point, but you'll still be able to access your historic data. Then at some point after that window, they're going to cut it off and it's going to disappear forever. So from that July date through till 6 months, maybe a bit longer, you need to start thinking about what am I going to do with that data? Do I need that data? And if I do, how am I going to get that data into my own systems? So you can't, one of the questions we get a lot is, can I move that GA3 data into GA4? And you just can't. The way the data's collected and the way it's stored is completely different for the two platforms. So there's no way for you just to copy and paste that data in.
Okay, so what do you do?
So it depends on how much data you want and what you want to do with that data. You can simply go into the Google Analytics 3 interface. Mm-hmm. You can view a report, and then in the top right hand side there's an export button, and you can just export that to a CSV file. That'll take you a long time, and there's a lot of limitations.
A million views, export.
And you've got a limited number of rows as well. So if you have over 5,000 rows at a time, you have to click next, then re-export it, and then next again. So it'll take a long time. There are plugins. So for example, for Google Sheets, Google themselves have made a GA3 plugin.
Right.
You need to have a bit of an understanding of the API because it uses all the references to the dimensions and metrics from the API. But you can use that, and it does get around the limitations of number of rows.
Yeah.
But again, with that, you need to have the familiarity with the API, but you also need to understand what data points you want to export as well. So because you can only export 7 dimensions and 10 metrics at a time, that's all you can have in that report. So you've got to think about, okay, which metrics and which dimensions make sense together.
And also that's the thing, I think, is that where you don't just want to start like scurrying away all the data that's humanly possible without any possible use for it, if you're not going to be learning something from it, if you're not going to be able to compare it to the views that you're getting in GA4, if you're not certain about the accuracy of it. So I don't think it's as simple as like export,
just
export.
Get it all.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly, that is the thing. So there is that understanding of how am I going to use that data going forward, and what we tend to do anyway is that when we're looking back at historic data, if something is more than a year old, we start to trust that data less because the world was different a year ago, your website was different a year ago, and then going further and further back from there, the data becomes less valuable at a granular level. Sure, it makes sense to understand, okay, how was the general trends of traffic, but do I need to know every single minute how many landings on a certain page happened? Like you maybe don't need that, but you can get that if you want to. And as part of our offering, we're developing something to export that data and archive it for you. So we've already thought about the process in terms of what data points make sense for different types of industries, and how to get that data out and how to store it, especially if you've got a very big website with a lot of interactions. We can work with you to understand what data points you need and how to store that, how to share that with you, and then how you access it as well.
Yeah.
Because maybe you've exported that data and you've got a CSV file that not even Excel can open because it's got that many rows in it. What do you do then? Well, you've just got this file that you can't even use.
Yeah.
So we can give solutions in terms of like hosting that or guiding you through that process of how you access that data, import it into a database, for example.
But I guess the important thing is, although we know approximately 6 months, there is no confirmed date given yet. I think it'll be around about 6 months, but Google's going to be very vocal before the cut-off date comes, as they have been with the GA4.
That would be outrageous.
Yeah.
If they want,
It's just kind of sliding in. And I guess, so with the reports that you have in GA3, and we spoke about it a second ago, it's also going to be about understanding the difference of the data that you were able to get versus the reports that you can get in GA4. What are the most noticeable differences that you're going to see from GA3 reports through to GA4?
So there are quite a few differences, and it depends where you're looking at the interface that you'll see those differences. Filtering is a big one at the moment. It's very different to Google Analytics 3. There are basically different ways to filter, and only certain filtering can happen in certain parts of GA4. Within GA3, you either had a filter on a table, and it was just a simple matches text in some way, contains, doesn't contain, or you created a segment, and a segment you could apply to any report you were looking at, and it would filter that data. With inside GA4, it's a lot different. You have audiences and segmentations, but the segmentations can't be applied to the reports, but they can be applied to the explorations, which we'll get into in a bit, I think. And same with audiences. Audiences can be applied to the reports, but you can't see them in exports. They're not retroactive. So there's a lot of changes on that side.
I still need to fall in love with GA4. I'm still not there. Every time I'm like, well, yeah, and I think again, it's just that thing of being so comfortable with GA3, even if it's better, even if there's a lot more that you can do within GA4. I think for a lot of people, myself included, it's still going to take a little while to be as confident with the interface and the capabilities.
And while we have a few months, it does make sense to start poking around in it now, even if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah.
You have your GA3 data that you can rely on up until that July period, but the sooner you start touching GA4, the sooner you'll be able to start understanding the platform and understanding its limitations and its benefits and how to use it.
Okay, so I guess we're all going to have to do it, it's probably a good time to start looking at the interface a bit now. So do you want to just take us through, just in kind of a basic way, how to set up a report in terms of the interface? Be really good.
Yeah, so there are two main ways to look at data inside the GA4 web interface. It's down this left-hand side, you've got reports and you've got explorations. Mm-hmm. So reports are fairly similar to what you'd know inside GA3, where down the left-hand side, you'd have all your different reports split out into different sections. With GA4, it's a similar approach, but there's a lot more customization in there, in that you can actually create your own reports and put them in the menu system, so that in future you can just get back to them and they flow with inside the menu.
And like in GA3, you can then share those within other people's views as well, so you can give access to them. Exactly,
yes. So they're created for a particular property, but anyone else who has access to that property
has
automatically
sees
those
reports.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's like creating your own version of the interface for whatever your business needs and requirements are. So we're looking at the reports first, and inside here you can see down on the left-hand side we've got it broken down into very similar things to GA3. You've got your acquisition, your engagement, your monetization, and a few additional things as well. So for example, if we went into acquisition, there's a very simple report that's created by default called user acquisition, and this just shows you where people have come from in terms of their source, and a little bit of information about them. Did they convert? Were they an engaged user versus a non-engaged user, which is a difference from GA3. You may be used to bounces, but GA4 is more focused on engagement now.
More important.
The interface is always broken down into this exact layout that you can see here. So you have two charts at the top, and you can control what kind of charts they are, and then underneath you have a table, which is not too dissimilar from
pretty
GA3.
similar view, huh?
So these are the default ones, and I can take these and I can edit them. So at the top on the right hand side there is a customization button. I can click this and it will take me into the report, but now I can choose what's in the report. So I can choose the default dimensions and metrics in here. I can choose what's shown in these charts up here, and I can change the visualizations of those charts as well. But you can also create ones from scratch as well, which is what I'm going to show you now. So I'm just going to come out of here, so I'm going to press back at the top because I don't want to edit the actual predefined report. I want to create a new one. Down on the bottom left hand side there is a library functionality, and inside this library functionality, once it loads, it shows you all of the predefined reports, but you can also create your custom ones in here as well. So if I go create custom, now I've got two choices. I've got an overview report and I've got a detailed report. Overview is those widgets that you saw when we were talking earlier, where it was just a live view of some data or a chart. There was no tables, no real filtering that you could do with that. So we're going to do the detailed report, which allows us to have that table that you'd be used to with GA3. So I'm going to create detailed report. It gives you the option to set up something from an existing template, but we're just going to go for a blank one straight away just so you can see how it looks. And when it catches up, there we go. So down the right hand side, these are all the controls you have. Now it's fairly limited with what you can do, but it does allow you to have that customization in here. So for example, if I had a certain set of events that I wanted to show and only those events happening, maybe I have a form where I track users' progression through a long form. I could set this up so it only showed the events for that form and then the interaction metrics against it, as an example. But for this one, I'm just going to do a very quick top level example. So I'm just going to pick some dimensions, and I'm just going to pick source and medium as my main dimension. And we'll throw another one in there just to show how it works, and host name as well. And then under metrics, I'm going to add a few things in here, like users, some number of users. I'm going to add sessions. These are already existing in another report, but I just want to show you.
Just so that we can look at how to create one, absolutely. And I think it's like, I mean, we were saying this before, but you know, it's that muscle memory. Like the more you do something, the more confident you become with it. Just playing with it now, the more easy it will be. If you set up these reports, it becomes
exactly. That's so you start playing with these and seeing what metrics and dimensions you can put in there, how you can filter that data, and it'll give you an understanding of what you can do and what you're able to do and what you're not able to do.
And I think it's been really interesting when we have been migrating people and helping them kind of with their comfort of using GA4, but just having those conversations with them to help them understand what reports are best for their business needs. Because I think sometimes people do look at the very top level, you know, we're just going to look at conversions, we're going to look at revenue, we're going to look at, we're actually, again, because there's so much more, a lot of kind of the conversations we've been having with people as we've been setting up GA4 is around what is the best reports for the business and for different people in the business, and to understand different success metrics or objectives within the business, because you now have, you know, more potential within the interface.
Exactly, yes. And I'll show you how you can actually segment that into the different business interests that you have inside the structure of those reports as well.
Feels very, here's what I made earlier.
So I've selected some top level dimensions and metrics just for this example. I can apply filtering to them. So whatever filtering I apply, like I was saying earlier about the events, say I had a particular event set that was tracking the form, I could filter it now to say only show me those events. So I could go into these filters and say where the event starts with or contains, for example. I could add those filters in there, and then I can choose the chart types. So do I want to change the visualizations on here? By default, it's always a line and a bar, but there are
easily changeable.
A couple of other choices as well, so like this kind of chart. So once I have done that, and I'm happy with this report, I can hit save at the top, and then I'll give this a name. My first report, and if you wanted to have a description, you could add a description in there as well. So once I've saved that now, I've created this report, but it's not directly accessible through the interface when you first log in. You'd have to go into the library, then find that custom report. So what I can do is if I come back out of this now saved new report, we have these collections. And effectively all these collections are just folders and groupings of reports, and it's exactly what you see down this left-hand side here. So we have this lifecycle collection here, which is this section of reports. Same for Search Console, which is here, and User, which is the demographics, and Technology, like the device type at the bottom. So what I could do, for example, is say that report I've just created, my first report, maybe I want to put that inside the acquisition section within the lifecycle. So what I can do is I can edit a collection, and it will take me to a like breakdown of the folder structure.
Will it?
Here we go. So down here on the left hand side, you can see these are the different reports and the folders inside those reports.
Yeah.
And on the right hand side, I can search for those reports that I want to add in. So if I search for that my first report, I can now click and hold and drag that to wherever I like. So for example, I was saying I wanted it under the acquisition, so I can just drop it under there, hit save, and I will save changes to the current collection, which means it'll automatically apply to the menu system.
Yeah.
And then that should be now saved, so I can come back out of here. And in theory, when I open up acquisition now, it might need a refresh, but we'll see. There we go. So we've got my first report. So now anyone who comes into this tracking property, they could go under the acquisition and see my first report, and then that would load whatever filtering and configuration I've added into that particular report. And the world is your oyster here, so you could create any reports.
It is actually very simple. I think because there's so much opportunity for what you can do, I think that's often the thing that people feel quite daunted about. In GA3, you are presented with data, where here it's now saying like, this is your Lego box. What would you like to do? And I think that's it's a different way of approaching it. So I guess with reports, it is quite simple once you get your head around it. There's also obviously been a lot of conversation. I've heard a lot about GA4 explorations. So when would you use those? Kind of what's the setup for those?
So the way I've seen this is that the reports that we've just gone through.
Yeah.
So the way I've just seen this, the reports that we've gone through, those are for more of your top level business needs. So maybe you just want to see general performance. I see the explorations as getting into the nitty gritty and understanding why.
Yeah.
So you could go into your report and see something has changed notably, and I need to look at that and understand why. So then I would go into my exploration, which is a separate section, and I would build something more granular to understand what's exactly going on. So explorations are just under reports inside the menu. And there's a lot of flexibility with these. So with the general reports, you've just got your table and your two charts, and you can do some very top level filtering, like adding a second dimension, and that's about it. With the explorations, you can take any dimensions you want, any metrics, you can apply them together, and there's a lot of different visualizations as well. So you can just look at a raw table, which will just give you all of the results based on the data you've requested, or you could get a little bit more fancy with that, and you can have like
Always
funnels.
go fancy. Always go fancy.
So you could have a funnel, for example.
Yeah.
You can have user export, so you can see individual users and what they've done over their lifetime. There are lifetime reports in there as well, which are separate. So if I just go in and create a blank one, which conveniently I have open in a separate tab.
Look at you.
So this seems even more daunting, I think, than the reports interface. But this is only because there's a lot more flexibility in here for what you can do.
And I think it's like what we were just talking about before, but it's only daunting if you go in and you're not sure what you're trying to do. If you have your objective before you start building it, obviously if you just go in and start clicking random buttons, it's going to feel quite daunting. But if you have a clear view of what are you trying to get out of it, what data do you need to see to help you reach that understanding or that investigation, hopefully less scary.
Yeah, so
hopefully.
When I first came into this, what I did was just play around with it. So I just took the different parts of the interface, tried out what happened when I did this during an exploration, but with no real objective on that, just to understand the interface. Then once I'd done that, I stepped away from it, and then, as you said, I thought about what I actually wanted to show. What did I want to understand? Then come in with that so that you're not just dragging things that sound interesting together. You're actually trying to answer a specific question from that information. So I can give you a very quick overview of what this looks like. I won't set up any reports, but we'll just go over it quickly. On the left-hand side, you've got all your controls, and on the right-hand side, you've got the visualization of that data based on whatever you've set up. So from the top down, you can name the report, so you'll give it something useful rather than untitled report. You've then got your date range to choose what range of data you're looking at for the current report. You've got your segmentation, dimensions, and metrics. So dimensions and metrics are, as you would see them inside GA3. So you've got your dimensions, which are your text-based things, and your metrics, which are your numerical things. Segmentation, this is something that would be more familiar from Google Analytics 3. So these segmentations will only, when you set them up, will only exist within this current exploration I'm doing. So if I go create another exploration, I can't then just choose that segment that I created another one. It exists only in this single report that I'm building now. So that's really important to remember, because I remember when I first started, I'd create some segmentations of like, I'm going to use these on all these different reports,
Nope.
and then realize, nope, I'm going to have to recreate them all between the reports. So for each one of these, it's just a case of going into them, choosing the different metrics and dimensions you want. So I can go in, for example, let's just do the same thing again where we'll do source medium, for example. So I filter at the top for source medium, and I will pick session source medium, so that'll give me the source medium of the session rather than the default one, which is the users first. Hit import, and then that'll appear in the list. And I can do that for metrics as well. So that's the variable side. Now there's the settings side for it. So the first thing is your type of visualization you want to see. And there's a lot of different visualizations in here. Freeform is a table, cohort is showing progression over time, so how many users drop off over weeks based on whatever criteria and interactions you have. A funnel is someone who starts maybe on the home page, watches a video, goes to a product page, adds to the basket, and goes through that checkout process. You have your segmentation overlaps, which is really interesting. So if you have your user identification set up correctly, you're using Google Signals, and through your website when a user logs in, you're tracking that user ID and associating with Google Analytics 4, you can start to do some really interesting segment overlaps. For example, you can see how many users start on a mobile device and then maybe move to a desktop device, for example, and it shows you those overlaps. And you can take all those different segmentations and see where those different groups meet together. And
this is like what, when you were saying before about based on certain industries, we've obviously kind of worked a lot of different sectors now, and a lot of different industries, and there are kind of certain reports, certain views, certain interest points that are going to be more aligned to what their objectives are, or what their, the issues or restrictions of a certain sector might be. So I think there are definitely things, and we can do, and actually it might be worth doing a separate session for specific sectors, because there are so many reports that are so suitable for different sectors depending on needs, objectives, and the pitfalls. So that's something that we might come back and revisit, just because time-wise, if we begin to go through all of them, we'd be here for
a long time,
days and days.
So those are different reports. We'll just leave it on.
Lifetime value, is the only other one that'd be really useful just to touch on.
So the lifetime value, with the lifetime value reports, this will take a user's entire lifetime that GA4 has known them for, and you can build information about the users and then average that up. So for example, you could see on average how many times users purchase in their lifetime, the frequency of those purchases, the average order values over time for each individual user. So it gives you a lot of information that wasn't really available before in analytics, and especially when you combine that with something like Google Signals, which will use your Google account to associate you to being a person. So that cross-device user accessibility is so much more easy than something that was available in GA3 but no one really used.
Yeah, and it wasn't particularly.
It wasn't that granular either.
No. I think that is going to be one of the things which, obviously, as GA4 builds up, and again, it's really frustrating that there are still some companies who are just doing that migration now, but as long as it's done before July, that's great. But the longer you have those data sets in place, collecting accurate, comprehensive data, then the more you can get out of all of these new viewpoints.
So that's why we were driving last year. We were pushing our clients to get them all onto GA4, so we have that historic base, so we can start looking at this lifetime value information now, rather than starting to collect now and then having to wait.
It is super interesting.
It is, yeah. So just to finish off the report settings. So after I've chosen the type of report I'd like, I'm just going to keep the visualization just to being a table. I've then got my breakdown of my segmentation, my rows and my columns. So what I can do here is I can just drag across items from the dimensions and metrics and segments that I've enabled and place them into the report. So for example, here I can drag my source medium into my rows, and then it will show my rows. So I just need to add one metric in here. So I will just add in event count, just so we have something in here. And this will be very, very arbitrary, but
this isn't like the most meaningful report. We're not setting up what we think you should. This is just to show you the mechanics of how to set up.
So there, what I did was I dragged my sessions into the rows and I dragged the metric into the values, and it's generated that into a table. So now I can take that table and I can start exploring with it. I can right click them and start filtering by certain subsets of that data. I can drag in additional data points and break down, say, maybe I was just interested in this LinkedIn, for example. I could just break down the LinkedIn by some further information. And as you can see, it's like a research platform.
Yeah.
The reports is more, here is what's the state of play is on more of a top level. And then the explorations is, why is that happening?
I mean, the title of it kind of says it. It is
does
an
explain it, yeah.
exploration, you know. But I think, again, it's something that people aren't quite used to because we didn't quite have the same capabilities.
Yeah, so this was something they brought in Google Analytics 3 through Google Analytics 360. There was a version of this. And it was really exciting to have a client with that because you could have this kind of granularity and control. But it's nice now that everyone has that in GA4, which is great.
And then another question kind of just outside of this a little bit, but what's the difference then between segments and audiences is a question that comes up a lot.
So segments and audiences, they are similar in some ways, but very different in others.
Great answer.
Yes. There we go. So for segmentation, the segments only apply within these reports here. So you can set up a complex segmentation, so you can have your sequencing, which is something you could do in GA3, which people might be familiar with, and you can build those custom rules, but they only exist within this exploration, and that's that. Historically, it still applies, so I could set up some segmentation and then look back over the last year to see how that applies, but then I can't do anything with that outside of this exploration report interface that we're looking at right now. With audiences, I can take that segmentation and that same logic, but I can apply that to my Google Ads remarketing.
Okay.
So with that, I can say where users, a prime example is something like users who have added to basket but haven't actually purchased, for example. There's a nice simple one. I could create that as a segment, and I could see that within this exploration, and I could look back over the last year to see how many people have done that. But then I've got those figures and that's that.
Yeah.
Whereas if I create an audience, I can then pass those specific users into Google Ads and then start remarketing towards those users. The only catch with the audiences is that it's not historic. At the point of creation is when it starts collecting that bucket of users. And that bucket of users will change. You can say, in the last 30 days, give me the people that have done this. So it's a relevant group of people rather than just all people that might have done it in the past. Because you don't want to remarket to someone who came on your site a year ago and they're no longer on the site, for example. So that's the difference. Really,
just on that then, on the remarketing element, so how do you actually kind of set it up so that you can build the audiences to use on Google Ads?
So it has changed slightly. It used to be under this left-hand side tab, but really it made more sense because it was an admin setting that you would set up. So it's now gone into the admin side. So if I click on admin in the bottom corner, it will take me to something similar to this. So the first thing you might notice in the admin settings is with Google Analytics, you would have an account, property and views. And obviously views have gone now, so you've got this blank space down the right-hand side. But you can see under the property, we've got this audiences menu option. So by clicking into this, it takes me to a menu where I can start creating those audiences and then applying them to Google Ads. We have some very top level ones in here at the moment, but we can create some new audiences to demonstrate that. So all I need to do is click new audience, and then this will give me the same segmentation control that I had previously, just with a few options that are specifically geared towards an audience.
Yeah.
It gives you some examples, so there's some templates that you can choose from. The good thing about these templates is if I click on one of them, it will give me the configuration of how it's set up, so you can sort of use these as an understanding. It's like a jumping off point, effectively. So for example, if I pick this non-purchases, you can see how that's structured. You have an include section and an exclude section. And on this one, basically this is for non-purchasers, so it's basically saying exclude anyone who has triggered the purchase-based events. In GA4, there are 3 different versions of that. So I could refine this, or I could take the understanding of how this is made and then apply my own logic to it. What things to note on this side, so on here on the left, I've got my controls in terms of filtering my users, so what they have or they haven't done, the order that they've done those things in as well, because you can see we've got sequences as well. On the right hand side here, we've got some information about how those users should be applied. So by default, there's a 30-day window. So it's anyone who has not purchased in the last 30 days, for example. But I could increase this further, so I could say maybe in the last 90 days, anyone who hasn't purchased, just to make sure I'm not collecting someone who may have purchased 31 days ago, depending on what my marketing is going to be, the advertising that I'm going to push. And then underneath that, I have got this summary section, and it will show you who's included or who's excluded. Now, unfortunately, I've clicked non-purchasers, and this is not an e-commerce. So obviously, no one's excluded and everyone is included because no one has purchased anything on this site. But you would see an exclusion amount within inside this, and you get basically the two segmentation opposites, and the bit in the middle would be those that it applies to. One really cool thing you can do, or one thing that I think is really cool you can do, is when you set these up, is you can set up triggers to create a new event. So if I click create new here, what I could say is when a user has completed a certain sequence of interactions on the site, not only include them in this audience, but push an event into GA4 so I can create a report and look at that report against that event. So I could call this like non-purchase, for example. And then inside my event list, I would then have this non-purchase event in there, and anyone who triggers that, I know haven't purchased in the last 90 days.
You can kind of monitor the behaviours of that as well.
Exactly, yeah. So you could have a look. So this is giving me a snapshot over the last 30 days, but I could then leave this to record over the coming months and then look back and see how did that affect. Did those users who triggered this event then go on to purchase? Yeah. So we can see the success from that ad or that remarketing that you have done.
And just when we are kind of playing around, doing very useful things in the admin settings, what are some of the other main configurations that we should think about whilst we're in admin settings?
That's a very good question. So what I would say is the primary thing I see when I go into a GA4 account for the first time is no one ever sets up the retention windows. So by default, Google set the retention window for the shortest period, which is 2 months. And that makes sense for them because obviously they want to save money. But just having 2 months worth of data is not very
never
useful.
a good idea.
So what I would say is that's one of the first things that I would always check. So under data settings, there is a retention box or retention item, and you can choose between 2 months and 14 months. Always choose 14 months so you have that year's worth of data. Yeah. And that does bring us on to an interesting point here, is that with GA3, your reporting data would just collect and collect and collect, and you'd have years and years of that data. Yeah. As we said earlier, the older it gets, the less value it might have, but it's still useful.
It's still
to have
there,
that data. Yeah. If you wanted to look back. With this, you have a 14-month window, and if a user doesn't come back, if they go past that 14-month window with that interaction, it's then cut off and it's deleted and off into the ether. Okay. So one thing to bear in mind is thinking about, if I care about having that additional data past 14 months, I need to think about how I'm going to store that outside of the GA4 web interface. Yeah. And that's where the second thing comes into, which I'd say is important, is BigQuery. So,
what is BigQuery? Just to give a bit of a summary on it and why you love it.
Effectively, BigQuery is a database, but it's a database for huge amounts of data. It's part of Google's cloud projects. It does cost, but the cost is very minimal versus the benefit for it.
Okay. We were talking about approximate cost. I know that it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string, but we're kind of talking about for mid-sized e-com business.
So what you're looking at there is your usage of the data. So there are two costs with BigQuery. There's the storage of the data, and then there is querying the data. So storing the data is based on per terabyte, and depending on where you store it, it varies, but it tends to be, I think it's around £30 per terabyte. Yeah. But your first terabyte is free, and a terabyte is a lot of data.
It's a hell of a lot of data. Yeah.
Our clients haven't touched that terabyte yet, so from a storage point of view, we're not paying. Our clients aren't paying for that side. The querying side is where the charge comes in.
Yeah, but again, it's about being sensible for what you need and doing that piece of investigation kind of work, auditing, to understand what do you want to get out of it, what is going to be genuinely useful and insightful, and making informed decisions, which is where I guess you're working with our clients a lot about trying to understand what's the purpose of this and how can we make sure that we're getting and using our data in the best way to answer those.
Exactly, yeah. And BigQuery is quite a technical platform. It's got a querying language similar to SQL, so you need to have that understanding as well. So sure, it's quite easy to set up, but then to actually use it, you need to think about how you're using it. It's actually the way we recommend connecting your data to an outsourced visualization software as well. So something like Looker Studio, rather than connecting it directly to GA4, connecting it to the BigQuery dataset just allows you that more flexibility, but it also removes some of the API limitations. But again, you need that technical understanding in the middle. So that's where we come in, really, is that translation between, you've got this data, how do I visualize it? What do I visualize? Is that relevant? Is that important? What does that mean to me as a business? That's the translation that you need, and gets a bit more complicated. Other things to note with inside the admin settings, there is the reporting identities. So with inside Google Analytics 4, I've mentioned already there's something called Google Signals. And the Google Signals allows Google to identify a user based on their Google account. So if they're assigned into multiple devices with the same Google account, Google will know that that is Bob from sales, for example. And it will track Bob from his interactions on your website, on his desktop, to his mobile, to his tablet, for example. And it allows you to stitch that user together so you can get that full user journey. But there are limitations with that, in that if we can figure out Bob's information about Bob, we can filter GA4 to track Bob across its entire user journey. And obviously that becomes more of a concern from a data protection point of view. So what Google does to avoid that is it applies limitations to small subsets of users. So if you have Google Signals enabled and you apply filtering...
so Google Signals isn't auto-enabled?
No, so you have to accept,
So that's the first thing that would always make sure is done.
So you'd have to accept it first. But once you've accepted that, the reports will have limitations that if you filter them and refine them too much, so it's only got a small subset of users, it will then either not show you anything or it'll show you a rounded number.
You've got to protect Bob.
So, and that's fair. That is definitely a fair concern. But that is one of the limitations with Google Signals. So if you're not using the data that Google Signals gives you about users and from a remarketing point of view, I actually often recommend to turn it off. To avoid those issues where your reports are sampled or rounded or missing information.
So it's about not just collecting data for the point of it, it's about understanding what benefit can you get of it, how is it supporting my marketing decisions, my business decisions, etc., and then refining what view you have.
Yeah, exactly. Just because you've got that option, does it actually mean turning it on is right?
It's always really tempting to kind of data hoard.
Just turn it all on.
And
then the last thing I would say about the admin settings is the reporting attribution. So with inside GA3, the default attribution model was always last non-direct click, which means that whatever your last source was that wasn't direct, any sales will get attributed to that. So if I came to the website from an organic search, browse the website, left, then came back the next day, but I just typed the URL into the browser and it auto-completed, I would be considered direct. If I converted at that point, GA3 would give it to organic rather than direct. So that's the last non-direct click model. With inside GA4, the default attribution model is actually a machine learned attribution model. So it's about understanding the different data points and how they affect a user's propensity to actually convert. So it's not that clean, simple, what you last did is where it's associated with. And it will be the
same on,
And it's a great way to look at that because it can give you a greater understanding in terms of the value of different channels that appear at different parts of a user's journey. Sure, a certain channel might not drive that conversion, but it might drive a person to be aware about the brand in the first place.
And I think that's something that people are becoming a lot more aware of and bringing into their understanding of kind of channel interplay anyway. So it's great that this is more aligned to that.
Exactly, yeah. And the only trouble with it is that it is actually the default model within inside GA4. And the reason that's an issue is because if you come from GA3 and then you look at your GA4 data next to each other, you would look at them and they'd be different and be like, why is GA4 broken versus GA3? And it's not, it's just looking at that same data set in a different way. So it's about being aware of that. So if you wanted to sanitize your data and check against GA3, you would need to look about changing the model. So you can see, for example, in this property we're looking at right now, the attribution is actually set to the last click model, which is the most comparable one to GA3.
Yeah.
And that was done so we could check the data against GA3 to see that we were still recording the same level of users and there was no errors. At some point we will then switch that back and put it to the attribution model so we can look at a full user's journey in the attribution model. So that's just something to be aware of.
And I guess to be aware of it, when you change it, the collection points of that change happens from the date that you change it.
So no, that is a very good point actually. It will retroactively
Brilliant.
Change. So I can switch between any model and save it within the admin settings, and then when I go back to the reporting view,
It's automatically
all the data historically is updated to the model you've selected, and it's the same for anyone else. So if I change it in the admin settings, everyone who looks at that property will see that same reporting attribution model, and then if I change it back, it will change again.
Very interesting. And then I guess the last question, just because this is something that's come about a lot, and it's one of those questions that we seem to be getting asked a lot, is what is unassigned traffic in GA4?
So unassigned traffic tends to come from two places that we've seen most commonly. Only recently, Google Analytics 4 have introduced your own custom channel groupings. So for many, many months, in fact years that we've had GA4, you had to follow Google's predefined rules for a channel. And if you had a mistype or decided that a certain platform couldn't have those predefined rules set, it would go in unassigned, unattributed. And that's because it didn't match against the channel. So it would come from a certain source. So for example, email must always contain the word email in the source media.
Yeah.
So if you couldn't have that, maybe it was just mail, for example, that's the only thing you could have, that would not get associated with the email channel group.
Yeah.
And therefore it would just become this unassigned collective of channel data. The second place I see it, and I'm starting to see this more now, is we're seeing more clients use the user identification of their own website. So when I log into my account on a particular website, taking that user ID and storing that inside Google Analytics, what can happen is when you log out or switch user, or what we found a couple of times is where it's been not set up correctly, what will happen is when Google thinks that the user has changed, even when it hasn't, just because you've misconfigured your tracking, it draws a line between those interactions that happened before that point and the interactions that happen after. And because when you draw that line, there's no session start, there's nothing to attribute that against.
Yeah.
And so that becomes also unassigned traffic because Google doesn't know where it came from because it's sliced that user in half.
So it is something you can kind of work around in most cases?
Yeah, so for the first one with the channel groupings, in the past month they've been rolling this out slowly, but I think it's now available for everyone. You can create your own channel groupings.
Okay, perfect.
And that also works retroactively. So I can create a channel grouping and all of my historic data will apply to that channel grouping, and I can set all of my reports to that channel grouping, which you could not do in GA3 and was a nightmare. And then for the user identification, it's just about how you configure it.
Because of an error, which is just a common error.
Yeah.
And then is there, those I would say are probably, and I know that we've probably gone on a bit longer than we wanted to, but those are probably the biggest areas. And the main takeaway for you, the kind of main advice, just start clicking and playing?
Honestly, the sooner you can get into the platform and start playing around with the platform, it becomes less of this unknown fear, and you can start to understand how to use it and how you will apply that to your day-to-day. Because there's going to be a point in July where there's going to be that cutoff and GA3 data is no longer apply, and you're going to need to know about it. So I would say start now and just dig into it. You can't really break it if you're just looking at the visualization.
Challenge accepted.
Just get stuck in.
And then I would say the other thing is that no questions on GA4 are stupid. I have asked the same questions repeatedly for about 1.5 years. So I think also just not being afraid to ask those questions. If there's anything that we haven't covered today that you would like us to either just have a call with you about or to provide a bit more information about on another webinar, just let us know and we can always do a follow-up. And we will all be ready for the July date soon. So thank you, Jason.
No problem.